So once you take competition and market analysis together, then you can really develop a solid strategy around marketing. So at this point, you should have a good, solid value proposition. You should have a very good sense of your competition and what you're uniquely providing to the community. And then you should understand your customer. You should understand their motivations, their behaviors, where they're getting their information. And this is where a good marketing and sales strategy should come from. So this section should actually get into all the different things you want to think of. So the 4 Ps, positioning, pricing, promotion, and place. What are some of the different things where you need to go to really think about how you get to that audience and how do you convince them that your idea is a good idea? Because that's what marketing is when it's at its best, that's what it's actually doing. So marketing in this strategy section should really convince the investor that you've not only come up with a good idea, but you actually know how to get to the customers and convince them that it's a good idea, so that you can actually build market share, whether you're a nonprofit or a for-profit, in what you're doing, so that you can create impact or you can create profitability. So the first P that you really should be paying attention to is positioning. And so positioning is directly related to your value proposition as well as your competitive analysis. It's the thing that really distinctively positions you in the marketplace. So positioning is a way for you to look at your distinctive place, and sometimes your positioning statement can actually be something that you utilize in your marketing. So for example, if you have ever stayed at the Four Seasons actually puts their positioning statement out right by their beds. And so sometimes positioning statements are actually used in external purposes. Most people actually use their positioning internally. And we've given you an example of what you specifically could use for your positioning statement, and you can just fill in the blank. But the goal of positioning is to figure out where you actually have a distinctive advantage and what benefits you have that someone else doesn't have, so that you can really understand what are the things you need to be paying attention to when you're doing your marketing. The next P is pricing, and this is one of the areas where I think most people, especially in the nonprofit space, underestimate the importance of. So even if you're actually providing it free of charge, you may want to really understand what your pricing is so that when you're going to investors, you actually know what price you should actually charge them for the individual unit cost. The other mistake that oftentimes nonprofits make is not really understanding their full costs. So sometimes they're guesstimating what their cost is, or they understand what their direct cost is. So they know what their staff, they maybe know what their equipment costs would be, but they don't take into account their overhead. They don't take into account their evaluation. They don't take into account their cost of doing business. And so I fully recommend to a lot of my clients that you actually take a look at both direct and indirect costs and try to come up with a unit cost to really figure out exactly what your cost is. So what does it actually really cost for you to actually produce an individual class, for an individual student even, so that you even know what does it actually cost us to produce this. And then from there, you can decide what your profit margin is. Depending on the mission of your individual venture, whether it's more philanthropic or it's more profit-driven, or you're wanting to at least break even, you might want to put a little bit of a profit margin there just to make sure you have some wiggle room. There's always unintended consequences of different things that you're doing. So even if you have a cost, there may be extra costs that you need to put on top of it. So having that profit margin or some type of margin on top of pricing can be incredibly helpful. Let's say in a given day, you actually have a class that people don't show up for whatever reason, or there's the flu, or there's different things that happen. You don't want to be beholden to that individual price and then unfortunately don't make your goals for that given week. So having a little bit of margin actually makes it a little bit easier for you to make sure that you're meeting your financial goals. And then if you're actually looking at being profitable, you can actually look at what should we charge. Oftentimes nonprofits actually don't charge enough, and they oftentimes use their competitors as cues of what you're actually supposed to charge. And that is one of the cues, but you actually should look at other things. What benefits are you actually getting? What is the perception of value? So for example, being connected to a nonprofit alone may be something where people are willing to actually pay more, or they're willing to actually have a different benefit associated with what they're doing. So you may want to carefully consider that. For example, the one I always give is Girl Scout cookies. All of us are willing to shell out the money when that cute little girl comes down and offers us cookies, but if we were to go to the grocery store, we'd probably be able to get the cookies for half the price. So that cute girl and then giving back to the charity actually allows that price to be a little bit more than we normally would have actually spent. So spend time on pricing. It's an important area for you to pay attention to, and it will be a very important part of your financial model. The next is promotion. So promotion is incredibly important, and oftentimes nonprofits really pay attention to the action side of promotion. And there's a principle called ADOS, awareness, interest, desire, action, and satisfaction, that marketing professionals take a look at. Part of our goal is to move people along the continuum. How do we initially get them aware? Letting parents know that we're starting this clinic. Then we move to interest, then we move to desire, and then we move to action, that they actually sign up for the process. And then of course you want satisfaction. It's much easier to actually get to keep existing customers than it is to get new customers. And you certainly want those people through word of mouth to say, this is a really great class, you should take it. And through that satisfaction, people will develop that word of mouth and you'll actually get additional participants. So you want to pay attention to the satisfaction side. Oftentimes most marketing people pay attention to actually getting people to buy, but really the trick is how do you keep people satisfied and then keep that reinforcing loop of people coming in the door. So promotion is incredibly important, and making sure you have marketing strategies along the way is going to be incredibly important to making sure you have a sustainable business model. When you think about promotion, you also want to think about what role promotion is actually playing. Are you informing people about the program? Are you trying to persuade them? Are you trying to reassure them? So you all oftentimes want to use your customer segments, so maybe new customers versus existing customers, and do different messages for each of them. So for brand new customers, you may want to be informing them or persuading them specifically. But if you have existing customers, you certainly don't need to inform or persuade them. You just need to reassure them that things are going well. Maybe it's that progress report for individual parents about the changes in behavior that you've seen in their individual child. Maybe it's a coupon that they could potentially give to another parent so that they could actually talk about the program to other parents and they could actually start the process themselves of creating word of mouth. So finding ways to actually get them to do the work for you can be incredibly helpful. And you can see that the messages would be distinctly different depending on the group that you're working with. And also you have to think about all the different tools in your toolkit. Oftentimes people just think about advertising when it comes to promotion, but there's lots of other things. We just mentioned the moms talking to other moms. That's personal selling. You may want to do direct marketing, and that could be incredibly helpful. Maybe you have the local school district talk about the actual program, and maybe there's some type of benefit associated with that, which means a van directly from the school to the individual program. Certainly advertising is incredibly helpful, and if you can afford to do it, you certainly should. But there's also sales promotions and public relations. So maybe you do a ribbon cutting with the mayor, or maybe you do something that really kicks off with a celebrity the process of doing these sports clinics. So any of those can be really helpful, and any combination of those can actually make you even more successful. So be thinking about those tools in your toolkit and what makes the most sense depending on your target segment, as well as what you're trying to accomplish with that target segment. The next in our series is operations. So now that you have a marketing strategy, you want to think about how are you actually going to accomplish all these things. And this is where the rubber meets the road. You actually really want to make sure you have all the different pieces in place to make sure that you can make your program as well as your organization successful. So this includes all the equipment, the people, the capital, the materials, the systems. You may have to get an online system to make sure people can, from their computers, actually register their child. You may need materials and equipment. You may need some upfront investment related to that. You may need to hire coaches in order to actually help with the clinics. All those things can be really important, and you need to think about the sequencing that needs to be done in order to make sure it happens so that you can actually have your class on day one. So operations can be incredibly important. And you may be thinking, what's a good process to potentially go through with that? So as you think through all the different materials that you need, the people, the capital, the equipment, all of those things move into what your products and services are, and ultimately your customer experience. So one way to actually think about that is to actually do a process map. So a process map can actually allow you to really think through, particularly in a new sequence, what that sequence should look like. And this is another great brainstorming activity that I recommend that all nonprofits do, no matter what they're doing. It may be a new fundraising event, or it could be a program or organization that they're trying to start. The first process is really just mapping out all the process steps. So I typically say that you take, for each different area, think of about a different color of Post-it notes. So for example, with mapping process steps, you may want to take a yellow Post-it note. And what's nice about Post-it notes is that you can actually move them around. So you may think that the sign-up sheet is actually the first thing that you need to do, but you may find out that you actually need to do marketing before you actually do sign-up. Or you may find out that you need to get a meeting with the principal before you can actually go into the schools. And really thinking about all those process steps allow you a really good sequence. Step 2, and you would use another color for this, any color that you wish, so pink or purple or blue, you want to identify resource needs. So in every step in the process, you have a resource need that you go along with it. So that resource need could be everything from equipment to an online registry to an actual person doing the work. And that resource can be incredibly important to making sure that you actually have what you need when you need it. Number 3 is really identifying any constraints. So for example, as you start thinking about rolling out the various classes, you may recognize that you have the biggest constraint will be personnel, and making sure that you actually have a number of coaches to actually support the classes that you're doing, or teachers associated with it. So making sure that you're really mapping those constraints, and remember, those are ideal things to go into the risk section. Then, last but not least, defining roles and responsibilities. So this will go directly into job descriptions eventually, but it gives you a sense of who's responsible for what, who's picking up the phone, who's paying the particular vendor, who's actually talking with the principal. All of those things are things that need to be done. And if you create a process flow, it should make it very easy for you to figure out who needs to be involved, at what time, when do you need to hire certain people, as well as when do you need to have the resources available to those individuals. So a process map can be a very fun process using all these really great Post-it notes that you can move around on the wall, but also allow you the opportunity to really figure out all the different steps that need to go into making sure your venture is a success. The next section is organization and management. So you got to make sure you have the people. And oftentimes the people and the leaders are the ones that really make an organization successful. So this really goes into that detail. So if you've done the operations section correctly, the operations section will allow you to actually figure out what kind of people do you need and when. And typically when you look at a business plan, this is usually the section that most investors take a look at. They want to make sure that the leadership of the organization is strong, as well as the people who are involved have the right credentials. So in this case, it's much like a grant application where you would include job descriptions, an organizational chart, and a brief bio on the leadership. So this is a fairly easy section to complete, but incredibly important to make sure you have the right people involved. The next is the financial section. So the financial section is something that, of course, is incredibly important. If you're going to create a sustainable program or organization, you need to think through the financials. Where are you going to be getting the funding from? What are some of the major costs? Well, the good news in the operations section is that you actually have thought through all the different costs associated, the resources that are needed. So it should be fairly easy for you to walk through this process with the CFO, and that individual could be able to estimate fairly easily what are the major project budget items that are going to be needed, in addition to what you already currently have in the organization. So looking at a financial model is going to be incredibly important to make sure you figure out how much money you need to raise to support the organization, or how much startup capital you actually need to get it started. So in the financial section, which we'll be talking about in the next section of this, you want to make sure you have an income statement, a balance sheet, and a cash flow statement. And we're going to walk through those just in a brief detail to make sure you understand what's really relevant in a given business plan. And last but not least, the executive summary. And this is probably the most important section because it's going to be the most read. So part of your goal with this is to really create an enthusiastic snapshot of the venture. Your inclination here, because you're going to be tired, you're going to be overwhelmed, is to cut and paste from existing sections. I don't recommend that you do that. What I would recommend is that you read through the entire business plan, and when all of that is in your head, that you come up with an executive summary. This is the key things that people need to know. And sometimes there's more from one section versus the other. And you really want to make sure that this section persuades the individual that it's a good idea, that there actually is a market, that you do have a distinctive advantage related to the value proposition, as well as your impact. It should probably be no more than 2 pages long, but certainly if you want it to be a little bit longer, that's perfectly fine. And you definitely want to make sure it's something that stands alone. So this is where your advisory council can be incredibly helpful, because they can actually read this before they actually read the business plan and feel like they have either a good understanding of the organization, or they may have a less than good understanding, and you maybe have to refine it and add a little bit more detail. So be careful in this section. It's incredibly important, and I know your energy is probably low at this point, but the executive summary is probably the most important section that you would actually write. And it really does showcase your competence as well as your credibility. And you want to make sure both of those shine through in this particular section. You also want to make sure you have appendices that include everything from job descriptions to your financials, and maybe even your market research. This is where you may want to actually do this as a separate document, so that way when a person hits print, they're not printing 90 pages. We all have done that before and hate it. But you want to make sure that you have them available for folks, because if they want to deep dive into your market research, your focus group results, or any of the other elements, they may be able to get the additional detail that they need. But in this particular section, you want to make sure that you give enough information, but not giving too much information. So you just want to do the things that will allow people to be confident that you've done everything possible to do the research, and you've done the work on the financials to make sure they feel confident about their investment. In order for a good idea to come to fruition, you've got to have a sustainable business model. And the financial section is incredibly important for you to be able to accomplish that. You want to make sure that your investors or your customers have a good value proposition when it comes to actually supporting your program and your organization. So coming up with a strong financial model is going to be incredibly important in this area. As I mentioned, as part of your team, you should have people who have financial backgrounds, but I wanted to give you just at least an initial highlight of what goes into a good financial model. So some of the keys to success that I think are important. One is making sure that you don't focus on the wrong costs. So oftentimes you associate with a particular cost that really actually isn't a driver of the overall business. You also make those poor pricing decisions. Remember we mentioned earlier the importance of pricing. So wanting to make sure you make the right pricing decisions so that you can actually have a sustainable business model. The other thing too is spending time on things that aren't really driving profit. Oftentimes marketing is the biggest key to this, and wanting to make sure that the marketing that you're actually doing is driving to people actually being part of your program. From a success perspective, you want to make sure you're managing your costs appropriately and making sure you're paying attention to the areas where cost is a big driver. You want to make sure you're adjusting pricing as time progresses. So pricing changes based on your inputs. So making sure your pricing adjusts is associated with that. You also want to make sure you're really thinking about what your profitability is. So understanding why and how you're actually profitable and making sure that your financial model really takes that into account. And you may have multiple ways in which you accomplish this, but you want to make sure the financial model suggests all of those and that you're figuring out how to maximize those at every possible point. So when you think about your drivers of profit, and this is an important thing to think about, whether you're going to be profitable or you're going to be break even, you want to think about sales revenue as well as costs. So as we mentioned earlier, if you're going to be doing a class, you want to know what your costs associated are with those classes. And then you want to know the revenue that you're potentially going to get in. And the costs are associated with your variable costs as well as your fixed costs. So an example of a variable cost associated with your classes would be the equipment, for example. The more students you have in a class, the more equipment you actually need. The fixed cost would be the coach. The coach is needed no matter if you have 5 people in a class or 15 people in a class. And so you want to make sure you understand the importance of that. And this is where profit and your understanding of profit is going to be important, because what it means is you may actually have to make sure you know what makes an individual class profitable. It may not be profitable at 5 students. You may need a threshold of 10 to actually make a class profitable. From a revenue perspective, you want to think about pricing and making sure you have a price that is associated with the actual customer. In this case, you may want to have different pricing based on different customers, different classes, etc. But you, at the end of the day, want to make sure price is, of course, a function of your costs, but making sure the price actually, with the volume that you have, actually makes enough revenue to cover your costs, but also hopefully make a little bit of profit, along with that margin that you have from before. So making sure you're spending time on these things and really thinking through what you think is actually likely. One of the best ways that you can actually accomplish this is to talk to comparables and see in their first year, how many classes did they actually have? How many people were in those classes? How many coaches were they able to actually recruit? Oftentimes people are a little bit too overly optimistic when they first start related to the demand they may have. Certainly this falls in line with falling in love with an idea. People fall in love with the idea and they overestimate what the demand for something will potentially be and what people are willing to pay for something that they actually need. So really pay attention to organizations who just started and may have some of that financial data that you can actually use to create a good forecast and a good estimate of what you think your finances are going to be able to look like in year 1, year 2, and year 3. Next, you would put all this into a financial model. So you want to make sure you're putting together what your revenue and what your costs are so that people can understand what your major drivers are. And you want to break that out by fixed costs as well as variable costs. In general, you want to try to make sure everything is variable as possible so that you can actually make sure that you only accrue that cost when you actually get a student in a class. That's oftentimes difficult to do, but it's certainly something you want to try to do as much as possible. Then this gives you a good sense of whether or not over time you're going to be profitable or you're going to break even and what your total costs are going to be. So that's really important in putting together your initial financial model. Most likely, like the executive summary, you're going to be having multiple iterations of this. But once you pull your operations section in and you figure out what resources you need, what the sequence of activities are, etc., you should be able to figure out what a good financial model should look like for this. And then once you compare it against other comparables, you should have a fairly good confidence that your financial model seems like it would be the best possible financial model that you could have, given that you're not in the market yet. So once you get a solid financial model, those will lead to 3 financial statements that any business plan should include. The first is a profit and loss statement, which is oftentimes called in the nonprofit state your income statement. This just gives people a sense of whether you're profitable or whether you've lost money. I want to caution nonprofits, oftentimes we try to be profitable or break even in the first year, but even businesses are not that way. So think about all your costs included and be realistic about your projections in this area, because this is really gives people a sense of whether or not you really fully understand your business and all the different things that go into making it successful in the first and second year. Also, make sure you include the costs you actually need. Oftentimes nonprofits will skimp on things in year 1 and year 2 and then realize that that's hampered their ability to scale in year 3 and year 4. So make sure you include the costs you actually need, even though that may actually show a loss in the first year. So pay attention to these particular areas and make sure you have an income statement that actually is prepared for growth and not just for profitability. The next is your balance sheet. This gets into your assets and liabilities, as well as an understanding of whether you're a good steward of your money. This is just for an investor to see quickly whether or not you have a financial strength to actually move forward with this program, as well as whether or not your organization has been managing its money in the past in an accurate as well as credible way. So a balance sheet can be about the organization. It can also be about your program. So just make sure you're paying attention to what that's going to look like over time. And the last financial statement is probably the most important. The number one reason why businesses go out of business is not because they're profitable or not. It's because they don't have enough cash to actually pay their bills. And so cash flow is incredibly important. There's probably seasonality to the cash that you have, and you want to make sure you have a good inflow and outflow of money to make sure you can pay your bills, but you also have the necessary revenue to actually get them paid. So cash flow gives the investor an appropriate understanding of whether or not you're managing your money appropriately and you fully understand how money comes in and when money is going out. The next part that I think is incredibly important with a good financial model is understanding your capital. So capital is really important for a number of reasons. One is you've got to have capital to get a business started. And so you also need capital to get a program started. So if it takes you a while to actually get reimbursement from your funder, you need to figure out how long that's actually going to take. So there's two types of capital that you should be paying attention to. One is startup capital. So that's the startup capital that goes into buying all the things the day before you actually start. So that includes the basketballs, the equipment, the things that would actually go into starting the business. Maybe even the online tracking system to make sure that people can actually register. But the working capital is actually the capital that most people forget. It's the capital that actually you need until you're actually profitable and can actually pay your bills outright. So making sure you're thinking about how you cover your costs all along the way. So your capital, when you go talk to a bank or you go talk to an investor, should be both your startup cost as well as what you think that working capital is going to be until you can actually be profitable or break even. So this is particularly important if you're doing a business plan and you are wanting to be profitable and you're going to an investor assuming eventually you're going to be able to be sustainable. But it's still important with a funder because oftentimes funders are asking for you for sustainability. So they're looking for the future state, which is when you could potentially make this sustainable through individual program fees or through other funder mechanisms. So you want to make sure that you have enough working capital to actually get you to that place, and you don't want to underestimate those costs associated with it. So sources of capital. So that's always one of the big questions I always get is how do you actually find these sources of capital? Obviously, debt is one possibility, and particularly now with banks being very interested in trying to make a difference in the community, they could be a very important ally in making sure that you have the debt you need, or even just lines of credit to make sure that you have the cash that you need when you need it. The next can be donations. Oftentimes there are entrepreneurs out there who maybe don't want to donate to a regular program, but if there's a sustainable business model associated with it, or if it's a social enterprise, they're very interested in potentially using their donation as a source of revenue for the organization in the long term. In some ways, this allows that donation to last in perpetuity. Then there's also equity. If you wanted to open up a for-profit business, you could actually give equity. And that's certainly something to consider, and I certainly would encourage you to talk to your general counsel or one of your lawyers on your board to talk through the pros and cons of potentially doing that. There's also grants. So a number of foundations are very open to actually giving up planning grants to get these kind of programs off the ground and making sure you're putting in the right resources to make sure that the organization and the program will be successful. So a grant can be a very good way to get some seed capital to get things going until you find a long-term revenue source to actually support what the organization is doing. Oftentimes that means that you're having to sell the organization and sell the value after you get that seed capital, but it can be a really great way to show value early on. And then of course there's always self-financing. It can be a great way to use your endowment funds or to use some money that you potentially have through a rainy day fund to actually invest in yourself and invest in the community. So oftentimes social enterprises are started through self-financing. because they see the opportunity in the long term to make money to support the overall organization's mission. So you may want to consider also self-financing some of the work that you're actually doing. So those are some sources of capital that you may want to consider. Again, I would encourage you to really take advantage of those financial and legal experts that you have on your team to really ask them specifics and figure out the best combination for your individual program and nonprofit. So the final steps. This is the thing that really makes you stand out among all the others. So at this point, I can imagine that you're probably overwhelmed, you're probably tired, you've written a whole lot, and oftentimes it's really easy just to want to submit what you have. But truly, you want to make it a visual story of the overall business plan. So I encourage people to take the time to really polish it to make sure that your best effort is out there. So I would definitely encourage you to hire an editor to make sure that the business plan is written in a consistent voice and actually speaks really strongly about your business proposition. So an editor can be incredibly helpful. The other thing you want to do is make sure that you are inspiring other people through your work. And so making sure you're using appropriate visuals and making sure you're thinking about all the different types of people who are using it. Some people are visual learners, some people are auditory learners, some people are kinesthetic learners. So making sure that you're using the document to really speak to all those styles. So you can make sure that you put a lot of dense statistics in a table, or that you use text boxes to make certain things stand out. Or you may want to actually use visuals to actually talk about the operational elements or the project plan. All of those things can add variety and actually can oftentimes be a better way to actually put your information out there so that it can be digestible in an easy format. So I would highly encourage you to really think about how could you be using visuals, how could you be using pictures to really help tell the story of your business plan as much as possible. So you want to really create a balancing act. So how do you say enough without saying too much? You want to make sure you're being succinct and straightforward. So oftentimes this means you're taking a lot of information that you've pulled together and really making sure you create a document that actually speaks with one voice. This is where the editor can be incredibly helpful. You also want to sound like you're really serving the needs of the population so that it's an incredibly strategic proposal as well. The goal here is to really sound smart, but also to be understood. Sometimes you have to think about how do you actually convey the information so that everybody can understand it. This is why outside readers are so incredibly important, because they can make sure that you're really getting your message across and people really understand your message. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. We hope you had a little bit of fun, you learned a little bit about business planning, and I hope as a result of this you're actually going to try it for yourself. It can be a really rewarding process to actually start new programs and actually allow your programs to be even more successful than you ever imagined.